a hawk-headed guy, and you say Art Deco, and thousands of cigarette lighters, coffee tables, and more intensely realized than you ever actually encounter these things in real life. Well, now what does that mean? I have no idea. First of all, the possibilities seem to be that what we call styles, or what we call motifs, are actually categories in the unconscious. But the amazing thing about it is, having looked at the Italian Baroque, dynastic Egypt, and Art Deco, you can also say to it, "So surprise me." And suddenly, it can surprise you 100%. It can show you objects that you cannot place to any set of motifs, any historical period, past, present, or future. And then you can say to it, "Surprise me again." And it gives you surprise B, which is completely different from surprise A, and also not related to any known style. So then you say, well, are styles categories in the unconscious, and how many of them are there? And what does it mean then for a group of people in 1680 or 1930 to suddenly find one of these places and punch into it? And then another question is there a necessary historical progression, or is it by chance? In other words, could the political world of the 16th century have lived with the design motifs of Art Deco? Could we have had Columbus arriving in America in a ship consonant with the best canons of Bauhaus design? Strange questions, friends. Is there necessary succession in style, or are these things pure chance? So, I don't know, returning to and responding to your demonic advocacy, it may be that going to Tikal preconditions you, that pushes the button, and then when you take the psychedelic, you discover that the high Mayan, the classic Mayan button had been set, and then you find all this stuff. It's a little more bewildering to have it happen in your living room. So,
my feeling about it is that those experiences are available to anybody in various states, and there are various ways to get there. And I don't feel that it's mutually exclusive to say that some substances do seem to have a certain predilection for certain kinds of experiences. Now, I've had both feelings about it. That range of experiences, that band of experience is available, and some things are more likely to put me there than others.
Well, LSD is a relative of morning glories. So if you got Mexican imagery off LSD, that would be understandable. It may be that all the indoles resonate together. And, Rupert's fond of saying the morphogenetic, or the thing which is most impinging on the present, is the immediate and most closely related past. But also impinging is the related past moments and the related contingencies. Perhaps all of the indoles can access each other. One thing that I've done on psilocybin, and you might try this is an interesting experiment. Once you get it up and running smoothly, then you can say to it, be MDMA, and it will be it. And you can say to it, be LSD, and it loves to do imitations of other psychoactive drugs. Well, I don't know. I don't think you can say to MDMA, be DMT, and it will move. You hope not, don't you? And it would move over into that space. But see, obviously, it's some kind of freely commanded modality in the psyche with which we can have a relationship if we will but evolve a control language and a dialogue. And it remains mysterious. It is a point that I made yesterday that I think is worth repeating. The psychedelic experience is the beginning of the spiritual path. That's why it's not important that yogins claim that they can deliver you the psychedelic experience, because it begins with the psychedelic experience. And then you go from there. I said something like this a few weeks ago at the John Ford Theater in L.A., and this guy got up and said, "So why don't you take more?" Which I think is a very interesting question, very valid for me personally. And the answer is, our whole lives we conceive of spiritual development as looking for the answer. You know, is it Taoism? Is it diet? Is it Tantra? We look for the answer. And I think we have become so accustomed to looking for the answer that it's never really entered our minds what it would be like to find it. To have it, yes. And once you come face to face with these psychedelics, the trail ends that you have found the answer. Not because perhaps because you're smart, perhaps because you're lucky, perhaps because you deserved it, perhaps because you hang out with the right people. You have found the answer. Now the question is, what the hell do you do with it? Because the answer is going to make hash out of your life, because your life is based on living without the answer. So suddenly, it's not, I want to be an enlightened being, I want to be a shaman, I want to be a Taoist, I want to be a yogi. Be it. See how you like it. So the answer to the question, why don't I take more, is because I'm attached, basically. It is entirely my own attachments that now impede my spiritual growth. Nobody's holding me back. Nothing is holding me back except my sense of the awesomeness of what is now possible. And this is true of everybody who reaches a certain point. Think of the Taoist sage on Cold Mountain, who has been up there in the fog and the mist and the rock escarpments for 30, 40, 50 years. And the people in the village occasionally mention him to each other and say, is old Fu Si still alive? Has anyone seen him recently? And someone will say, oh yes, I saw him 3 years ago across a valley gathering wood, but when I approached, he ran further up the mountain and disappeared. To be Fu Si is entirely possible, to actually attain what we have previously thought of as unattainable spiritual accomplishments. But I don't think it can happen without leaving everything. Do you really want to be a Taoist hermit circulating the light for 200 years in a cave high up above timberline? You can, there's nothing stopping you once you understand that this psychedelic vehicle is available. I'm appalled at that. It's one thing to change your life to be nicer to your coworkers. It's quite another to change your life to be incomprehensible to 99.9% of all humanity. So once you have the psychedelic tool in hand, then real choices have to be made. What is this to you? Is it simply something that you do once or twice a year to affirm to yourself that it's possible? Or is it something that you can use in some way for your good and the world's? That's sort of where I have come to rest, and I hope it's not a delusion. But I think that there are ideas out there, and that they don't do any good out there, that they only have efficacy if brought into 3 dimensions. And there are all kinds of ideas. In fact, they are all ideas. So we're talking about a more efficient internal combustion engine, how people can learn to love each other, how to save the planet, the most efficient way of packing crackers in a box for long shelf life and low destruction of their structural integrity. It doesn't matter what the problem is. The answer can be found out there. Well, it puts people who are into this psychedelic thing in an entirely different stance from all other spiritual seekers, because all other spiritual seekers are furiously seeking. Psychedelic people are holding it back with all their power, because they are in the presence of the mystery, and then the trick is to get a spigot on it so that it can be turned on and off rather than just coming at you like a tidal wave a mile high and 20 miles wide. So it's a different problem, an embarrassment of riches, an embarrassment of access to past, present, future, alien dimensions, mantra-hoarding elves, and promise-bearing demons. And so strangely enough, it creates a certain kind of conservatism. Now, I don't think that everybody realizes this. Many people take psychedelics in order to prove to themselves that they can, and then gain acceptance from their social group. It's a way of fitting in. But those people, you can always evade the mystery. Not always. But if you're trying to, from the get-go, you can evade fully confronting the mystery. And but if it's what you want, you will quickly discover that you have hit the main vein, and that changes the rules of the game pretty entirely.
People quit over a period of time. They'll do it up to a point, and then it's particularly sophisticated psychologists and people like that say, well, it'll take you so far, but then there's something else, and you have to quit doing this and give it up and do something else. And my experience is what that is. It's not true. That if you want to keep doing it, it'll take you as far as you want to go.
That's what I think. I think people who quit doing it see something, detect, because what it is if you think of the self as a diamond, and you begin to, and then what the psychedelic is pressure on the diamond. Well, you can raise the pressure to 1,000 pounds per square inch, and there are no structural flaws. But if you raise the pressure to 10,000 pounds per square inch, micro flaws begin to show, and shear lines appear. And because everything will fly apart at a certain level, one cannot encompass this mystery. I mean, I think finally you have to avert your eyes and just, adore is a strange word, and worship is also a strange word, but certainly give credit to. It is not a program that you finish. And yes, people who say, I learned all I could from it, probably learned mostly that they shouldn't do more of it.
It threatens to put them out of a job, especially if
You're a psychotherapist.
Well, it threatens to put anybody out of a job, because eventually the contradictions of living in this low-level slice of reality will just become unbearable. And this actually happened in the 60s. I mean, many people quit and dropped out for many reasons, but the seed of all that talk about is, you just say, this is absurd. I am going to sit. That's not absurd. But, what about your stock brokerage? What about your portfolio? What about your divorce in progress? So all of this, how you can't... No, I think that the depth of this cannot be taken. And eventually, the male ego in every single one of us, regardless of our gender, will feel threatened. Because it's hardly different from death, because you're not going to recognize yourself. That's the point that I wanted to make in talking about the guy up on Cold Mountain. Once he ran a gas station. Once he followed the Dodgers. But then it all began to slide in this certain direction, and he is no longer recognizable to himself. Carlos Castaneda has Don Juan say, "You must lose your personal history." Well, I don't know whether Don Juan is a real person or whether he ever said that, but it's interesting, that notion. How many of us would be willing to become unrecognizable to ourselves? And yet, obviously, that's the path that one is on. And so then you just decide, well, is there an obligation to go to the end? Do I have to become a genie? Do I have to become a Taoist sage, an immortal? And I think the answer is no. One doesn't have to do that. Buddhism creates the notion of the bodhisattva. That is, in a way, this same thing. It's where you're just about to go over the hill into incomprehensibility, and then you say, wait a minute, what about the people in the prisons, the naked, the hungry, the oppressed? And you pull back and say, no, I forswear enlightenment until the last being attains enlightenment. Well, it's a noble gesture, but I'll bet these bodhisattvas make this vow with a tremendous sigh of relief. Now they know what they're going to do with their lives. Oh, good, I'm going to work in prisons and counsel the dying and get into political action. Geez, for a minute I thought I was going to go straight into the light. And become unrecognizable to myself and lose my definitions and so forth and so on.
I will. Okay.
The two words that struck me interesting was adore and worship. I don't know if I got it right. Matthew Fox Friday night quoted some theologian, I think it was Desjardins. Mm-hmm. And it struck me interesting because he said that we have come to a point in history now where we must either find some form of meaningful worship or commit suicide. And somehow that quote came back when you mentioned when one may reach that point of the penultimate truth of the unspeakable or the formless form or the light or whatever you want to call it, and the mushrooms are pointing the way or whatever, breath therapy, that all these things are only something that points you to the ultimate. And when you get there, it moves into the adoration and the worship level, which, interestingly enough, as I say, coming from a mode of being a recovering Catholic, I could never find in any kind of religious community, and didn't want to join a monastery for that purpose. And what I see is partially this neurosis or unhappiness that exists in so many people in the country. They have no contextual format for worship because it doesn't have that power for them to do it.
Yes, well, you have to have the personal experience of something to worship. And this is what has been lacking. I mean, what the churches are peddling is high abstraction, and you really have to work yourself up into a lather to, be able to accept that as worthy of that kind of attention. The psychedelic subset of society is into an experience. And, it's accessible. In a way, we're like Calvinists, not in our ethics or our restraint on behavior, but in our insistence on a direct personal relationship with the mystery. And this is something very new. We have really accepted the idea that truth descends through hierarchies, basically from Newsweek and Time and the Washington Post down to us as consumers of these various images of what is going on. The notion that you might know more about reality than the combined editorial board of Scientific American and the Journal of Foreign Affairs is startling stuff. We always give ourselves away. We don't realize it depends on you, to believe that at Cornell or down at SRI people understand the universe is not helpful. You must understand the universe. And if you don't know partial differential calculus, then your model of how the universe works must do it without partial differential calculus. In other words, it's not writ anywhere that only one model will work, and in fact, I think all abstract models should be highly suspect. It's going to be, it's an opportunity. I mean, we have to view life as an opportunity. What are you doing with it? Are you afraid of it? I mean, some people live their lives, apparently, what they are doing is arranging their deathbed scene. They want it to take place in a large baronial house with clipped green lawns, acres in surround. They want the room in which they die to be filled with fine art. They want their loving heirs to be dutifully assembled while they pass out the final wisdom, and they spend their entire life creating the dramatic scenario of their passage. And of course you have to work hard because you've got to make the money to buy that house. You have to sire all these children, educate them into your values so they won't be stabbing you in the back and misbehaving in this situation. You have to create loyalty, possession, power, all of these things. And then you won't die in a ditch, unknown and abandoned, But on the other hand, what was the quality of that life, Life is an opportunity. How much pressure should you put on it? How many places should you go? How many drugs should you take? How many sexual configurations should you experiment with? How many professions should you... and it depends, I think, the question is, how seriously do you take it? Do you just think life is a lark and it's fine with you that you're going to go into a pine box and be forgotten for all eternity? Or do you have some inner consolation that that won't happen and you're going to go off and be with Lao Tzu and Mao and everybody else who ever died? Or, just what is it? And I think of it as a telephone booth being filled with water. And you can see that when the water reaches the top of the telephone booth, you're going to be dead as a doornail. And so you have 30 years to figure it out. We are alive. There's no contest about that. It's extremely improbable that we should be alive, that we should be here thinking, feeling, sharing. The fact that we're alive throws open the whole game. Means anything is probably possible. But I doubt that it's easy. I'll bet you have to be very, very smart to figure out what's going on and get it right. And so I guess I have a sort of private religion of intelligence. It isn't how good you are, it's how wily you are, which was the Greek virtue of Odysseus. That was always his epitaph. Or his epithet was, he was wily Ulysses. Reality is some kind of maze. It isn't to the swift that the race goes. A maze, a puzzle garden that you walk through to try and find your way out. The race isn't to the swift, it's to the thoughtful, the careful, the one who can tease it all apart. Well, for puzzle solving, the psychedelic is this tremendously powerful tool because it extends the domain of mind, and that's what's necessary to make it go. Okay, moving through these things and discussing dosage, probably in order of the likelihood of your encountering them. Mushrooms, I feel that people who weigh around 140 pounds should take 5 dried grams. This is a stiff hit. This is a committed hit. There will be difficult moments in a 5-gram trip, but on the other hand, certain questions will be solved forever for you because you will validate the existence of this dimension. You will see what your relationship to it is. I don't believe in diddling with these things. The people tend to take tiny amounts, thinking that 1/10 of a dose is 1/10 of an experience. Well, that doesn't work like that. I mean, half a dose can be no experience at all, and a full dose can feel like 10 of these experiences. So trivializing it is really, and I use this word advisedly, but sinful, because you're trivializing the only mystery, or it's like trivializing sex. I mean, the ordinary objections to pornography are not my objections, but to my mind, a very strong objection to pornography is that it trivializes. And anything which trivializes anything central to our self-definition is bad mental hygiene, is about the only way I could put it. And taking small doses of psychedelics tends to trivialize them. And there are people who probably take LSD every weekend and go dancing and have done this for years and have no idea what LSD is capable of. The main shift in the use pattern with LSD is from it may have been childish, but the style of the 60s was, how many mics can you bolt down? You know, have you had the 500? Have you had the 1,000? Have you had the 2,000? Well, eventually it becomes moot because you just dissolve into shimmering atoms for longer and longer periods of time on these trips. But the modern approach, which is how little can you get away with taking and still be one of the gang, is even more insidious, you know, because then people feel capable of talking about these things. And you know, there are people who feel that their opinions on the psychedelic experience should be weighed very carefully who have only taken MDMA. Well, listen, I've got news for you. I mean, that is, to the domain we're talking about, like a broken tricycle to a Testarossa Ferrari. So this is a general comment that you should take a committed dose of whatever it is you're taking, so that there is no ambiguity, because there's nothing worse than a sub-threshold psychedelic experience, because what it is it's all show and no-go. You know, you feel the CNS activation, you feel the keyboards light up, everything comes on, you start down the runway, you pick up speed, you pick up speed, you pick up speed, and then you come to the end of the runway and taxi back to the hangar, and, you know, well, that was not a flight to Boston, that was just clogging the traffic pattern. So committed doses, and then because you're going to take a committed dose, inform yourself of the medical and pharmacological chit-chat on the matter so that you can feel reassured, you know, and talk to a heart specialist. Questions like, if my heart is pounding, does that mean I'm having a heart attack? What is a fibrillation, and how will I recognize it? Because you can have very odd feelings and not be in any danger whatsoever, you know, and your heart can pound. It's made to pound. Look at all these aerobic exercise freaks. Well, the fact that you're sitting still and this begins to happen doesn't mean that you've been shoved to death's door. It just means, you know, that everything is equalizing and coming to some kind of equilibrium, and you're passing through a transition. These drugs do have a kind of mock barrier. In other words, there is a barrier somewhat like the speed of sound. It's a pharmacological and physiological barrier. So you take the compound, the plant, whatever it is. Nothing happens for 40 minutes or so except false starts and little things, and you have to go pee, and then you come back and you sit down. And then it begins to come on, and it's like it can have many manifestations, but it can be chills, tremoring, knotted stomach, nausea, just restlessness, so forth and so on. This is what I call, taking a page from the engineering book, Q. Q in engineering circles is vibration in a physical system. And you may even, when they launch the space shuttle, if you listen to the radio chit-chat, they will say, approaching max Q, and then they'll say, max Q, mark, and then they're through that. What that means is that as the system approaches a transition, it begins to shake. It begins to shake as though it's going to shake to pieces. And the Q forces are building on all the air surfaces, the airframe. Then you break through that, Q falls to zero, and you're in the cool, main engine cutoff. You are now in orbit. All vibration has ceased. Noise has ceased. You are in orbit. You are weightless. You are there. It's different. Now you shut down all these switches related to the launch procedure and begin to set a course through a different kind of medium, a medium characterized by smoothness, stillness, and that sort of thing. LSD, I don't see anything wrong with the 300, 400 micrograms as an initial dose. I don't see any point in running up into the 1500 to 2000 gamma range, because in my experience what happens is at higher doses there's simply an area where you can't remember what happened, and the higher the dose, the longer that period of time. But since you can't remember anything about it, why, it should be shortened. DMT, 70 milligrams, vaporized in a glass pipe, and 70 milligrams. Yeah.
LSD, I have done large doses of LSD at times, and it's always seemed to me that it's very difficult to process all the stimuli coming in. The biocomputer just, at one point, for me at least, one time I did 4,000 micrograms, and the biocomputer shut down for a while. I like you said, I forgot exactly.
Yeah, it's overload, and it just shunts it past you. What do we need to cover here? DMT, psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, which I think probably you all know, 125, 150 milligrams. And because I tell you these doses doesn't necessarily mean I approve of all these things. I'm just saying if you take them, these are the doses. Ketamine, people take small amounts, again, usually after attaining some amount of proficiency with it. I've only done it 4 or 5 times, and always fairly large doses, 130, 150. Interesting compound, but contraindicated because of physiological problems. Depresses the immune system, possibility of epileptic kindling. Certainly, if you were to vomit in that state, you might well strangle because you wouldn't be able to clear your throat. I don't like what I have against ketamine also is you have to shoot it, As I was driving home last night, I was listening to some program, and they were talking about intravenous drugs. And I thought, how interesting. That's a distinction you don't hear made very often. They were saying, we should legalize all drugs except intravenous drugs. Well, so that's, of course, morphine, cocaine, heroin, ketamine, steroids, I suppose, like that. That's an interesting distinction, operationally. Yeah.
You can't haunt ketamine, can't you, then?
You can, but I would, I've heard that it's dangerous because... Yeah, it's IM. It's IM. When they give it as an anesthetic, they give it 600 milligrams IV push, which must be just like being struck from behind by a freight train. I'm sure you never know what hit you. I mean, imagine an exploratory dose is 100, let's say, IM. They're talking about IV directly into the vein, 600 push. that means pressure on the feeder, so it's just like a high pressure filling of your gas tank. You would never know what hit you. Yeah, although now they've pulled it from general surgery, even veterinary surgery, because it seems to depress the immune system. And the worst thing you could do is do surgery on somebody and then put them into a surgical recovery ward with a depressed immune system. So that is kind of out. I must say about ketamine, it did something to me that nothing else has ever done, which is it erodes the observer in a way that the indoles don't. On ketamine, you can get so out there that it is a major intellectual breakthrough to realize that you're on a drug. In other words, there's this situation, and it seems like it's always been there, and it always will be there, and you can't remember who you are, or what you are, or where you are, and this situation continues, and there's something about it, but you can't quite put your finger on it, and there's never been anything else, there'll never be anything else, and then suddenly comes this tiny thought, you're on a drug. Oh, right. I remember now. That's it. I'm a human being. I took a drug. I'm a human being, and I took a drug, and that's what this is. This is a trip. Right. That's it. This is a trip. I'm on a trip. Now I've got it. Now I'm in. Well, what this means is you're now coming down. The trip is now over with because you have, yeah.
Well, I had this experience with mystery.
Being so lost that it was a victory to realize...
No, not a victory, but I was just in that state where there was only eternity. There was no trace back to any family member, to anything. I just knew that this person which was sitting was a familiar person. From somewhere I knew this person. And I felt calm with that.
And it was yourself?
No, there was none. My sitter was there.
Oh, I see.
Who was sitting in the next room. But I was for hours just totally... no connection to anything which was connected to my personality or to life.
Was that a 5-gram dose?
Yes.
Uh-huh. Well, I think probably, I would imagine that this is...
It was amazing. It was wonderful to be there. To see that everything is just made up of our mind, and to see how this world is made up. And, why do we have architectures and polys and all this? It's just incredible to think about that.
Yes, maybe this is the white light. Maybe this is what these early LSD people were so enamored of, was getting so far into it that you don't even know you're into it because you can't remember where you started from. It sort of is not what I'm shooting for because I always want to bring stuff back. See, my conviction is... Oh, no, I had my conviction reversed. But my belief is that... my belief is that this stuff is important for all of us. That we're in some kind of lower dimensional slice, and what you see in the psychedelic experience actually has historical implications. And I find this sort of paradoxical because I'm the person who draws everybody's attention to the fact that people have been doing this for 50,000 years. So in a way, that sounds like I'm saying it's not a big deal. It's part of the human heritage. Certain people have always known about this. Yeah.
Where does it start, though? Like that point between where there's nothing and then all of a sudden, coming back in, the observer kicks in. That's the big issue in my life. Is like, where did the observer come from? Is it an evolutionary thing? Like animals never have it when they fade into the white light? Do you have anything to say about that little place in between, way in there?
Well, I think it begins with self-reflection. In other words, the question, what's happening? I don't think animals ever ask that question. For animals, what's happening is what's happening. But we are capable of creating a state of distance and posing the question, what is happening? And at that point in the trip, it means you're making your way back to the modality that you left from. You're drawing away from the translinguistic place. And it truly is translinguistic. Nothing can be taken out of it. But at the interface of the sayable and the unsayable is the novel, the new, the never before seen, said, or done. And that's what I think it's important to try and bring out. Ideas. Because I think we are the animals that bring back ideas. Somehow our hunting and gathering adaptation then set us loose in our own minds. And, somebody came back and said, let's throw a chunk of this meat in the fire and see what happens. It's this see what happens attitude. So then suddenly they discovered, meat burned in fires is easier to digest and tastes better. And by this means, this let's see what happens approach to things, the ideas come in the mental dimension. The let's see what happens translates those of them that can be translated into three-dimensional space. Let's plant this plant. Let's slaughter this animal. Let's try sex this way. Let's go over that hill this year instead of that hill. And what has come out of this is the entire legacy of our cultural heritage as a global civilization. But all of these ideas began in the mind. And what are ideas? Well, this is the central question of Platonic philosophy. And what are we that we seem to separate the doable from the undoable in the realm of ideas, and then anything that can be done, we do. It doesn't matter how perverse, how painful, how destructive, how grandiose, how wonderful, how sublime. If it can be done, we do it. And then, in this three-dimensional domain of space and time, these ideas compete with each other like organisms. And an ecology of mind evolves. That's really what culture is. It's the ecology that mind has created for itself, in the same way that bees create a beehive, and then the beehive is the cultural context of bee-ness. We have created civilization through language, and then civilization has become the context for humanness, and yet we always seek to transcend it and go beyond it. Now, I don't know whether this is something innate in us or whether it is somehow programmed in from the planet at different levels. Because it's very interesting, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but there are leafcutter ants in the tropics. I mean, they're a major part of life in the tropics. And they march in columns through the jungle, and they can swarm up a tree and take all the leaf material off a large jungle tree in a matter of hours. And what they do with these leaves is they return sometimes great distances with these, each one carrying like a little banner, a chunk of leaf. And they go down into their nests, and they chew it up, and they stick it on the walls. Or some of them go back to the surface, and they gather spores on their antenna, and then they go back down into the anthill, and they inject or inoculate the chewed plant material with these spores. Well, naturally, this chewed plant material is pretty organic and funky, so it begins to grow all kinds of things
molds, mildews, bacteria, so forth and so on. And what the ants do is they farm this and weed out all these bad bacteria and small microfungi and organisms, and only cultivate this one fungus, which then converts the plant material into a usable sugar. So what this is it's a symbiotic relationship between the fungi and the ant. And the ant is getting an enriched food out of this, and what the fungi is getting is a cultivated situation where all its competitor organisms are carefully kept away and weeded out. Well, this is precisely, in my model, what is happening with the human species at a more complex level. In other words, by domesticating cattle, we have set up an environment that is very favorable to the growth and appearance of what would otherwise be a very rare deep forest mushroom. But because we domesticate cattle and clear land so to do, we have created a huge circumtropical global environment in which these mushrooms can reside. What they make for us is not sugar, but ideas. You know, something we need the way ants need sugar. And these ideas take all kinds of forms, and then we refine them. And see, I'm not sure if I made the point strongly enough in the Friday night lecture. I really believe that human populations that do not have contact with the psychedelic tremendum are neurotic because they are male ego dominated. Yeah, big ego. The reason I call it male ego is because women, by virtue of physiology, basically, are pretty unavoidably welded to the nitty-gritty because they give birth, they carry children to term, and those two things which are biologically dictated. There is also the cultural dictate that women are usually involved in preparing and burying the dead in traditional societies. So women know how weird it is. I mean, surely to give birth must give you a perspective that anybody who's never done it just cannot hope to have. So the male ego floats on this myth of separateness, that no woman has the luxury of entertaining because birth, pregnancy, menstruation, care for the sick, care for the dying, these are boundary dissolving activities that keep women close to the nitty-gritty. The male organism can go off into its own private Idaho, pretty much. Often what child rearing means is the simple act of impregnation. And then that's the contribution in many cases in primitive and modern societies. Death is something the women take care of. Birth in primitive societies, men are never present, and women do it alone or with other women, so forth and so on. So in these Neolithic and Paleolithic societies, this tendency of the ego to tumorize and grow in individuals was kept down by a chemical regulator, which was the psychedelic experience. It was part of the food chain, and it suppressed ego. much in the way that drugs are given in prisons to suppress libido, because it's hard to manage highly libidinous people in an institutionalized situation, especially when it's only one sex is involved. So this natural regulation of the human species by regulating this psychic function called ego was disrupted with the invention of agriculture. And the hunting-gathering society, with its deep involvement in ecstasy, and it was these weekly or bi-weekly psychedelic orgy ecstasy picnics that people used to have, that gave way, and Weston LaBarre makes the point that ecstasy is not at a premium in agricultural societies because it's disruptive. What is at a premium in agricultural societies is the ability to get up before dawn and pick up your tools and go to the fields and work like a dog. And if people have been up all night before dancing and tripping, and they can't do that. And so the psychedelic gods are replaced by cereals, corn, wheat, rye. And of course, at a very early strata in the Neolithic, you do get the emergence. I mean, Fraser is full of talk about the great corn god and Tammuz and all this. So we are living the legacy of millennia of cultural neurosis in Western civilization by virtue of the fact of the untreated growth of the cancerous ego. And we know this. It's simply that we assume there is no cure. We assume that it's natural to have ego and that it's somehow unnatural to suppress it. But wherever you have an outbreak of psychedelic use in a high-tech society, then you see refeminized, hang-loose, communal, caring values come into prominence within the community. Somebody had their hand. Yeah.
Two questions. One is, have you seen a difference in the way men and women react to psychedelics, given the fact that maybe perhaps men embody a stronger male ego than women on balance? And then my other question has to do with the role of kind of the observer ego when you're doing drugs, whether it's marijuana or alcohol or especially psychedelic. So I was just sitting here thinking that the reason that I don't take anything stronger than marijuana is that, as your experience, I mean, I lose myself even in a strong hit of marijuana. I lose my ego completely, and I mean, I guess that's just a different form of the experience if I don't get really fearful and paranoid, but it's easy to get scared when that sense of observer ego just goes, because then I don't remember that I'm on a drug trip, and then it seems timeless and eternal, and then I come down later, as you were saying, the backside of the high, I go, oh yes, I just took some marijuana 2 hours ago, everything's fine, I'll recover tomorrow, and so yeah, maybe talk a little bit about that, and what people can do who maybe don't have a strong ego structure, whatever it takes to do these powerful drugs. I don't think I would be able to handle
Well, if you don't have a strong ego structure, chances are you're not a heavy-duty male dominator, because they're sort of antithetical. I think probably cannabis was a major ego dissolver, and that all these things have been used this way. And if that works for you, that's fine. I didn't take psychedelics to lose my ego, although people said that would happen. I never quite understood what was meant, but looking at it as a mass phenomenon, where you're not talking about an individual tripper, but tens of thousands of people, inevitably this feminizing of values seems to take place. What was your first thing?
Do men and women experience psychedelics differently?
I don't know if they experience them differently. I've never quantitatively looked into this, but my impression is that it's less of a surprise to women, and that they feel less of a need to do it. Particularly, I think this is true of cannabis. I'll bet that 2/3 of cannabis use is male use. And why is this? I'm not sure. Maybe women have too much work to do, too many obligations. I mean, the old man can sit and smoke dope, but somebody has to do the shopping and get the kids to school and pick them up and keep the insurance paid and all that. But women, I think, have a different relationship to it. Women are often shamans, and in fact, the best shamans in many cultures, if you ask the people in the culture, are usually felt to be women. Women are connected up to all of this stuff. Drug taking may not be a male enterprise, but history is a male enterprise. I don't think we would have ever gotten into it if it had been up to women. In a way, the women outsmarted themselves because they had not control in the conscious sense, but they were sitting in the front of the canoe when and then they invented agriculture, and that undercut their own position, because the vast repository of plant knowledge that had been the secret knowledge of women, it no longer really mattered. As long as you knew how to grow corn and a couple of other things, the vast encyclopedic data on wild plants became less important, and it becomes more labor intensive. And men, because they had evolved toward being efficient hunters, probably did have a physical edge on women in terms of stamina and an ability to, work with a hoe for 8 or 9 hours a day. Because what the women did when they were in their, in the prime cultural situation was they gathered, they looked at stuff and talked about it with each other. And this was this domain in which language then arose. And gathering is not hard work. It's just steady work. And it's lots of fun if you do it with your friends. And, the cliched notion about Aboriginal peoples is the women chatter, this phrase, the chattering of women in primitive situations. It really is true, I think, that women avail themselves of language much more than men in these pre-literate situations. The men are hunters, and they act like hunters. They're stoic. They hold it all in, literally. I mean, the larger bladder size of men is thought to be related to the hunting adaptation and so forth. So the men are stoic, they're holding it in. The women are information freaks. It all rides for them on information. Where do you find it? How do you cook it? What does it look like? Is it poisonous? What time of year is best? What soil is best? What do you combine it with? Is it good all year round? What do the flowers look like? What does the fruit look like? So data, information. How could you ever understand the use and location of 600 plants or more unless you had a tremendously evolved vocabulary for this kind of thing? Yeah.
A couple of practical questions. One, the physical weakness that follows substances like psilocybin, is there any way to prevent that?
Well, the physical weakness, these things take energy. I mean, obviously during the trip, energy is being sucked into the moment. I mean, a trip is hard work, even if you're just sitting still. So then there's going to be an energy debt. One way of assessing the toxicity of a drug, in the course of this weekend I've named several ways, and they all need to be used together. But one way of assessing the toxicity of a drug is how do you feel the next day. Psilocybin, what I do when I take mushrooms is I usually take them about 9 at night. By 1 or 2 in the morning, it's usually past. And then I eat before I sleep so that I don't wake up in the morning with a protein debt. And that's very important. If you will eat before you sleep after a trip, it won't be nearly so hard to come down. MDMA, one of the things that's really appalling to me about it is here it is, this pretty minor psychoactive, and my God, the day after is tough sledding. I mean, for a hangover like that, you should at least have seen God, you know. Now, LSD, we said if you drink a lot of water, that cuts the thing. Yeah, vitamins are never a bad idea at any point in these things. LSD, which I said yesterday, was so effective at low doses that on that scale it appeared very non-invasive. I feel terrible after taking LSD. I mean, it takes me 24 hours to put it back together. The interesting exceptions to this, and the causes, you know, it always seems to cut my way in terms of favoring the ones I think are most interesting. DMT is again the anomaly here. DMT is the most powerful hallucinogen there is. If it gets stronger than that, I don't want to know about it. And 15 minutes after you do it, you feel as though you had never done a drug. You are down 100%, mentally, physically, spiritually. It just returns you to the baseline. Ayahuasca goes DMT one better, and ayahuasca is the only one that I know of that does this. And I maintain the reason these things behave this way is because they are so similar to brain chemistry, ordinary brain chemistry. Ayahuasca, you actually come out slightly higher than you went in, and it isn't lost. You know, I mean, you feel great the day after an ayahuasca trip, usually. I mean, it depends. If it's your first trip and you spent 8 hours vomiting, you're probably not going to feel so good. But if you had, if it was a ordinary ayahuasca trip, then you're going to feel much better the day after than you did going in. More connected, more alert, more energy. Well, this must have something to do with the fact that the constituents of ayahuasca, harmine, harmaline, DMT, all occur in the human brain. And DMT, same thing. Now, why this doesn't happen with psilocybin, I don't know. Psilocybin doesn't occur in the brain, but it is a very, very close relative. I think DMT is absolutely fascinating from every point of view. Why is it so benign? Why is it so powerful? Why is it so short-acting? Why is it so hard to get any? That's the $64 question. Believe me, every book on drugs that you will pick up will say it's easily made. You know, people are making. They ask you to believe that people are making it in their kitchens all around you. Well, I don't know. A recipe?
You're talking about 5-methoxy?
No, not 5, but DMT, NN-DMT. I've seen it botched many times. The literature doesn't tell you that. I mean, botched, ruined. If somebody comes to you with a grainy, dark brown syrup, forget it. That is not what it looks like. That means they swept the floor after they dropped the retort or something. What it looks like is it looks like orange mothballs. It looks like a crystalline, waxy, orange to pale rose to yellow kind of substance, and it's very aromatic. And if someone shows you a liquid or stuff which looks like brown sugar or, it's a mess. We were appalled. We got samples of underground DMT and ran high-pressure liquid gas chromatography on them. It literally looked like the guy swept the floor. And these people had actually done it. I mean, I wouldn't have given it to a rat, much less a human being. The notion of someone actually taking that stuff was just hair-raising. What you should have is a very, very steep spike at 620 nanometers. And what we got looked like the Himalayas, is running around all kinds of stuff. There has been DMT around which was shootable DMT, which is the hydrochloride. And since I don't shoot things, I didn't pursue it. Although what people tell me, and this is interesting and something to bear in mind, is shooting is not as effective as smoking. People think that shooting a drug is the most effective way because you see it all go into your body or something. I don't know. But if you shoot DMT, it takes about 5 minutes to come on, and it lasts about 45 minutes. That's why if you read in the literature how long does DMT last, it will always say 45 minutes. But if you smoke it, the peak experience lasts 400 seconds, something like that. I mean, it's extreme. That's why it's so astonishing, because it is so intense, and the onset is so sudden that it's more like something has happened to you rather than that you've taken a drug. In other words, and sometimes people come out of it saying, what happened? Have we done it yet? Or was there an earthquake and the roof fell on me just as we were about to do it? It has the quality of an event rather than an experience. And also it has the quality of an event because it does not touch the core observer. You are not changed. What's changed is the sensory input is changed. You are still who you are. You don't think you're God. You don't feel bad about yourself. You are exactly who you were before you did it, with the same set of concerns. But you have been whisked into an alien dimension, one you never had imagined existed or could have a moment before have conceived of. And suddenly it's 100% in place, 360 degrees around you. And then, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 10 minutes later, you're raving to your friends, and it's as far away as that trip to Majorca 4 years ago,
So you make a major distinction between 5-methoxy-DMT and NMDMT in terms of the quality of the experience?
Oh, yeah, they are day and night. I mean, 5-MeO-DMT, some people like it. It's a feeling, is what it's been for me. It's this huge feeling that kind of sweeps through you, and it's velvety, and it's hard to describe, actually. But the main thing that I'm noticing when it's happening is I am not hallucinating. And, of course, the main thing that's happening with DMT is you're having hallucinations so intense, so three-dimensional, so highly colored, so sculpturally defined that it's more real than reality. And by that I mean, if you look at this room, notice how all edges are slightly feathered. There is, at all boundaries, a slight indeterminacy. But on DMT, it's hard-edged. Everything is just defined. Sometimes people say it's as though all the air had been pumped out of the room. You're seeing it with that lunar starkness and clarity, and unimaginable objects off the art scale, and entities. DMT is the only one of these psychedelics where I have seen the entities. On psilocybin, it speaks, and it's audio. On DMT, it's you see these things, and I don't know whether it's my personal mythology. For me, DMT is the center of the mystery. I mean, I fear it, I love it, I thank God for it. I wonder if I'll ever understand it. It takes a huge mustering of courage on my part to do it, because it just is so. I mean, we talk, change, transformation, other dimensions. This is not talk when you do that. I mean, you just do not know the parameters. I feel like I know more about what could happen to me if I'm in the Amazon jungle than I know what could happen to me when I'm in that place. And after many, many DMT trips, I've finally been able to paint a picture for myself of what is happening in there. And what happens for me, and I don't know anybody who's done it as much as I have. I wish people did it more and talked more about it, because boy, if there is a landscape where we need some consensus, this is it. I have been present when people did it, and they come back babbling about the same thing that I think I have encountered. I mean, they come back, and one woman said it was a carnival. It was a carnival it was an extraterrestrial midway. And somebody else came back and said there were gnomes, there were elves, and yeah, this is getting close to it. I mean, what happens to me when I do it is there's a period, an initial period of kind of hysteria and confusion. It's almost as though time speeds up, even before you take the first hit. Many people say, just before you do DMT, there's this funny kind of impression in the room, almost as though there is backwash from the event about to happen. You're caught in the psychic field of this event, and everything is moving faster and faster. This is like the Q phenomenon. And then you take the hit, and it's building up in your body, and your heart is pounding and everything, and then you break through to this place, and what it's like is the first impression is of the first impression is of the sound of cellophane being crumpled. That crackling sound, as if someone had just taken a bread wrapper. Yeah. Crackle that cellophane for us. That's it. More of that.
Are you there yet?
Would that it were so easy. A friend of mine says that's the sound of the radio intellecti of your soul tearing out of the organic envelope. Which is what it sounds like. It sounds like your body has just been wadded up and thrown into a corner, and now you're a radio signal, approximately 4 light seconds in diameter, spreading out through an alien universe. And the next impression is of a cheer. It's hurrah, welcome, welcome. and it's them, and they're waiting, and they can hardly wait. I mean, there's a moment when they're not on me, just a moment, and then they say, "You're here, we're glad to see you, why did you stay away so long?" And then they come toward me, and the main thing for me in the DMT thing is to struggle not to go into shock of wonder, basically. I mean, because there is a tendency, a strong tendency, and for the first few trips I couldn't conquer it. I was a victim of it. I mean, I just go into this. And I would say, heart, okay, breathing, okay, but I'm looking and I can't believe my eyes because I'm in some kind of domed place. And the impression, don't ask me why, but the impression is of being underground, even though it's a huge vaulted space and highly colored. But what is, of course, riveting my attention are these beings. And they're small, and they're like, I've described them as machine elves. They seem partially machine-like and partially elf-like. Yeah, no, they are not so mundane as that. They don't have a fixed body outline. And in fact, that's one of the things that's going on in this space that's so baffling. They come toward you, they're singing in this alien language which you somehow understand. It cannot be translated into English, but you understand it in that moment. And what they're doing is they are using their voices to produce objects. And so song becomes thing. And there are dozens of these things, and they're coming closer and closer, and the songs they sing condense into objects, and the objects themselves can sing. And these things come and they're saying, look, and they're holding this stuff out to you, and you look at it, and you're fighting wonder because your entire being is caught up in this can't be happening. And yet they're saying, just look. And what these things are devices, toys, works of art, objects. But whatever they are amazing. And you look into it and you can't, and they seem to be shifting, even though they're made of metal and glass and gems and pulsing. Everything is migrating and shifting and changing. And they say, look at this one. It's the most astonishing thing you've ever seen. And you just look at it and they say, look at this one. Look at this one. And they're piling up. And these things are coming towards you, and then they jump through you. They can pass through your body. And they're running around chirping and singing and making these objects. And what they're doing is they are saying, do what we are doing. Do what we are doing. You say, I just want to go back to New York. Say, later for that. And the implication is, and this is the mystery of my life, I'm teasing it out, trying to understand it, but the implication is, and the promise is, that ahead of us in time, 6 months, 50,000 years, is a visible linguistic channel of communication. That the thin channel of audio communication composed of small mouth noises is just a provisional kind of communication. And what is being proposed in this state is a true telepathy. Now, I always thought that telepathy means you think, I hear what you're thinking. What it actually turns out to be is you speak, I see what you mean. And I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean I see what you mean. so that your linguistic intentionality condenses as a three-dimensional object in front of us, a sculptural modality. So then we both see what you mean. You made it, and I'm your conversational cohort, and we're both looking at your meaning. And we can walk around it, we can adjust it, and notice that no common dictionary is necessary here. If you're Witoto and I'm Polish, I still see what you mean, because what you mean is an objectified three-dimensional modality, not a string of Witoto words. So that, and it's saying, do this, do what we are doing. Well then, this took me about 15 trips to get this far, and then I began to experiment with sounding in that state. And I discovered that they were right, that is a 3.5-foot wide, 8-foot long, magenta curved surface with lime auras, and that shifts the lime auras into rose pink and adds gray-silver pinstriping along one edge. And I thought, my God, what is this? So then when you break out into actual chanting, actually linguistically modulated sound, you discover you too can make these objects. And what they apparently are, how this could be, don't ask me, they are apparently syntactical sculpture. Sculpture made of syntax. Syntax suddenly becomes not the rules that govern spoken languages, but the rules that govern the assembly of three-dimensional thought objects. And as though words were the shadows of hyperdimensional intentions that can actually be broken through to. Well, my God, I just thought this takes the cake. I mean, I've never heard of such a thing. Nobody's ever suggested to me this is possible, so forth and so on. So then, as is the case with most things, if you look long enough, you discover precursors. And what I discovered in a wonderful book, and any one of you would love this book, I'm sure. It doesn't deal with the psychedelic experience by name, but it is a psychedelic book. It's called The Phenomenon of Life by Hans Jonas, Jonas. And if you can find this book, what a read. It's a group of essays, and one of the essays, he is talking about the etymology of the word Israel. And he says, following Talmudic thinkers, that Israel means he who sees God, that this is the actual etymological basis of the word Israel. So then, did I say that we're talking now about the writings of Philo-Judaeus? Yes. Philo-Judaeus, in discussing the etymology of the word Israel, says it means he who sees God, and then he says, what does this mean, he who sees God? Well, as you probably know, in the Hellenistic world there was this phenomenon called the Logos, and the Logos was an informing internal voice that tells you the right way to live. It's like a spirit ally that speaks to you and informs you. So Philo-Judaeus said, what would be the more perfect Logos? And then he goes on to answer his own question. He said the more perfect Logos would go from being heard to being beheld without ever crossing over a quantized moment of distinct transition. This is precisely and in fact what is going on in these states. Because now I have learned or have found out how to evoke this DMT phenomenon in the more controllable environment of the psilocybin intoxication. And it happens like this. First of all, I form the wish for it to happen. I usually follow a line I learned in an old I Love Lucy rerun where she's explaining to Ethel how she contacts flying saucers. And she says, I just say, come in, little green men, come in, little green men. So on mushrooms, I do this. I say, come in, little green men. And what begins to happen is this sound like bells, like very distant bells, and then it becomes louder and louder. It's sort of like bells with wind, and it becomes louder and louder and more complicated and more complex, and at a certain very, very hard to precisely define moment, it begins to spill over into the visual cortex. And then I see the language, and I can interact with it. Well, it is apparently a more perfect logos. This is what I had in mind in the back of my mind yesterday. Remember when I talked about how smoking was new to Europeans and they couldn't understand what it was, and then I made this offhand comment that it was a new use for the human body, only 500 years old. Well, it proves that there may be undiscovered uses for the human body. I mean, we've only been around playing with our bodies for 50,000 years, and we've discovered most sexual configurations and all these acrobatic things and amazing things that people can do, like make pyramids of 10 individuals and so forth. But smoking is pretty basic, and yet only 500 years old. Well, it seems to me that right under the surface of human neurological organization is a mode shift of some sort that would make language beholdable, and that if we could somehow kick over into this alternative mode, we would become unrecognizable to ourselves. Now, I realize this sounds pretty far-fetched, but you always have to have reference to context. In a universe where there were no people, that would be a pretty far-fetched idea. But the fact that we already possess language seems to argue that we are in the process continually of evolving new applications for our bodies, and that when language, spoken language, burst on the scene 35,000 years ago, which is most estimates, I mean, think of it, 35,000 years ago, people invented language. What must it have seemed like to them? It must have seemed like a miracle. Hardly anything sets you up for it. I mean, the difference between a 9-hour recitation of oral poetry and 3 chickadees on a line is quite a leap. And I'm suggesting that somehow there could be a leap forward in the communication dimension, and that this is, in fact, what shamanism is all about, what the end of history is all about, what psychedelic drugs are all about. We are edge-walking on an ontological transformation of what it means to be human. And the mode that this transformation will come in, it will not be political or technological. It isn't starflight. It isn't socialism. It's a whole other way of making our minds known to each other by being able to show each other our minds. And in psychedelic states, you can do this. Yeah.
Do you think there's any relationship to the Australian Aboriginal belief that the world, that the forefathers actually sung the world into being, that the song, that concept doesn't seem too far off?
That's right. Well, yes, as you say, in our own tradition, in principio et verbum, et verbo caro factum est, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. That's the whole story. What we need to do is pass through this transition and make the Word flesh. In other words, objectify the Word
somehow the word, and believe me, I talk about these things, but the pictures are provisional. I don't understand how it could be done. I mean, I'm an engineering type on one level. Is it an acoustical hologram? How in the world could I make you see a concept in my mind as though it were hovering 3 feet above the floor? Is there a way? And I've noticed on psychedelics, and again, I don't know whether this is a false trail or whether this is part of the mystery, but I've noticed on psychedelics that if you get a candle, if you get a person between yourself and a candle so that you have them in profile and they are raving and you can see the candle past them, there's something coming out of their mouth. It's like, you know how when you agitate oil in water and you see the swirling oiliness of water, or when you're in a swimming pool with too much suntan lotion in it, there's this kind of roiling discontinuity in it that's fairly subtle. Well, something like that is happening for about 8 inches in front of people's mouths when you look at them under certain conditions. Maybe it doesn't need psychedelics, I don't know. And in the middle of my field of vision, and I'm just watching them, and they stop dead. These two people, they must be 500 yards away, 1,500 feet away over these rolling green lawns. They stop dead, and then they scan, and then they start toward me. And I cannot believe my eyes that these people have changed course 90 degrees and are now headed right for me. And I kept telling myself, it's a hallucination, it's an illusion. They are not getting larger in your field of vision. You are not going to have to confront these people. Please, God, make it so. No reprieve. They're just getting larger and larger and larger until, and so I said, I'm going to make this go away by not looking, and I'm just going to sit like this. And I sat like this, not moving, until the guy's feet entered my field of vision. And then I didn't move, and I didn't say anything, and then I just looked up, and he said, "You're from which place?" "You have been how long in India?" And it was the grilling, which any Indian tourist knows. Any citizen of the subcontinent can approach you any time of the day or night, anywhere, demand to know your name, how long you've been in this country, and then the kicker. "And what do you think of India?" And this question is asked for the specific purpose of observing your discomfiture, because they know damn well what you think of India. And so I looked up and I gave this guy my most penetrating gaze, and I said, "I cannot be interrogated." And then I just put my head down and waited, I don't know, an hour. And when I looked up, they were gone. But only in that circumstance of being so stoned would I have ever behaved that way, because the normal tourist reaction is, and they watch this happen to you, you just go into a tailspin of, it's their country, everybody's a person, I'm a stranger, I should be nice, they're harmless, what's so bad about this anyway? And then, and so then you pair it out, you explain, I'm from San Francisco, California, I've been here 3 months, so forth and so on. A friend of mine told me a funny story about taking the Bombay-Calcutta mail and arriving in Calcutta on this train, 4 o'clock in the morning, and he gets off the train, and there's a little sadhu man over there, and the guy starts toward him and comes up to him, and my friend said, "Wait a minute, before you say a word, my name is Nathan Jones, I'm from Brooklyn, New York,
I've been in India 3.5 months, and I hate it. And the guy said, oh, you're great, Baba. You're reading my mind. You're reading my mind. You gotta be fast. That's all there is to it. Yeah.
Over the last couple of days, you've said that the mushroom basically creates its own agenda. You've also given examples of how you've directed it. So which of those is true? And if you can direct it, are there ways to direct it to specific regions by doing specific things?
What kind of a region?
Well, the first thing is, do the mushrooms have their own agenda? And second of all, if you have some control over it, how do you get to where you want to go? Whether you want to deal with certain issues like death or the body or whatever, or to get to certain regions of consciousness.
Well, it has its own agenda in that it has this, it has certain qualities, this extraterrestrial outer space, a planetary, history is ending, apocalypse, millennia kind of thing. You can direct it if it likes the way you're going. It's sort of like a strong horse. You know, if you're going the way it wants to go, you're fully in control. Otherwise, not. I mean, I can remember situations with mushrooms where I hadn't taken it for a long time and I fall into confusion, and it usually revolves around, am I doing the right thing, whatever the right thing is. So then I'll take mushrooms and wait until properly, and then put this question, am I doing the right thing? And it reminds me of a press conference that Lyndon Johnson had once, shortly after he became president. Somebody asked a question that he didn't care for, and he said, what kind of a chicken shit question is that to ask the President of the United States? So when I go to the mushroom and say, you know, am I doing the right thing? It basically said, what kind of a chicken shit question is that to ask me? And I think that was a very good answer. That was what I needed to hear, you know. I mean, are you kidding? So, you know, it can be, you know, my father used to say you can drive a horse to water, but a pencil must be lead. And I think that that's sort of the situation with the mushroom. If the question pleases it, it will answer. If the question doesn't please it, you'll hear about it. And it is amazing how it gives people what they need. You know that Rolling Stones song, you don't always get what you want, you get what you need? I have a friend, dear friend, but arrogant. No doubt about it. This guy is arrogant. He definitely thinks he has the truth by the throat in most situations. And he won't take mushrooms because it gives him such a hard time. You know? I mean, and it says, you know, you're arrogant. You want to know what we do to arrogant people? For God's sake, lift it off me. So a certain amount of humility. It's a relationship, like to a crusty Zen master or something like that. And it is really like another entity because you cannot predict the answers. I mean, I remember a dialogue that I had with the mushroom early on where I said, what are you doing on this planet? And it said, you're a mushroom, you live cheap. And so he said, He said, listen, this neighborhood was not so bad till the monkeys moved in. To you, it may look like a mess. To me, it was paradise. The mushroom is very, very weird. I'll tell one more story, then I'll try and get off stories. But and all these stories. Why am I doing all these dialogue? But why am I doing all these ethnic imitations? I'm not sure. There's one in this story, too. I was in Malibu with all these fancy film people, and we went out to dinner. Ralph Abraham was there, too. And there was this French woman there, a film producer, and she was seated next to me at dinner. And before dinner, we had been talking about the mushroom, or I had been introduced to her as the mushroom man and this and that. And she said to me, and you'll see why the story I just told relates to this, the story about you're a mushroom, you live cheap. And she said to me at dinner, she said, "You say that the mushroom speaks to you, but I do not understand exactly how this works." And I said, well, it's sort of like it has many faces that it can show. Like sometimes it's like the role that Rod Steiger played in The Pawnbroker. And at that precise instant, Steiger shows up at the table to shake hands with everybody and slap a few backs, and then he just drifts off into the recesses of this restaurant. And Ralph Abraham, who was sitting across the table from me watching this whole thing and had heard what I said to this woman, reached across the table to me and said, "You see, the mushroom is showing us that it can touch us anywhere, anytime." Strange stories. Synchronicity. Yeah. Yeah.
How do you remember to bring back what you've learned?
Oh, that's a good question. That's an important question. That's a key question. Roland Fisher, who was a great psychedelic researcher with psilocybin and later retired to Majorca to be Robert Graves' next-door neighbor, coined the phrase state-bounded. This means you can't bring it back. And I'm sure you all have had the experience of dreaming, being caught up in some incredible dream with strange people, foreign countries, exotic costuming. The alarm goes off, and as you stagger out of bed, this is just melting like an ice cube in a blast furnace. And by the time you're out of bed and fully dressed, you have nothing, not a shred, not a hint, not a clue. It's absolutely gone. This is a state-bounded memory. Chemically, what's going on is apparently short-term memory transcription is just not occurring. You're having the immediate impression of these things happening, and then it's not going to disk, so to speak. It just is lost. Yeah?
My experience is also with dreaming is not to be afraid that I'm losing what I'm dreaming. You know, in the moment I'm afraid that I'm not getting hold of, I know that's gone. And in training myself in knowing everything, and so I'm how do you say that? I'm tuning my body to remember everything what I'm getting. Before going to bed, or I'm taking my dreams as learning. Also, being learning during the nighttime, and it's that I'm telling my body to take everything. So even if I don't know it really consciously the next morning, it's there, and I make the experience that it's really there. Sometimes I have just a feeling, and I'm noting down the feeling. I'm trying to feel it again, and I'm knowing something happened, and I shifted something tonight, and it was like this and that. And I know that I did my work, also if I don't know exactly what was going on. But it helped me a lot in just knowing that my body has so many possibilities to memorize, that it will memorize. So I'm not giving air to fear that I'm not memorizing what I'm doing.
And the dream is not truly lost in that situation where you wake up and it melts away. And the proof of this, and I'm sure you all have had this experience, is then you go off about your daily business, and then there will be, and it was almost always by coincidence, an image, a chance phrase, a view of a street or something, and it will cause you to remember the dream. And once you get a hook into a portion of the dream, if you then work on it, you can probably bring a lot of it out. How this works in psychedelics is, if I have an insight or something that I particularly want to remember, first of all, I will say it aloud. This is strong imprinting. And then the real imprinting is to repeat it a few minutes later, and then a few minutes later again. And if you can carry it over a number of minutes to several different levels, it won't leave you. A very useful shortcut for this is a tape recorder, where if you play the tape of the trip back after the trip, you will just a phrase spoken will set off a chain of associative recall, and you will retain it this way. But to my mind, this is one of what shamanic training must really be, is mnemonic training. That if you want to bring the stuff back, you have to train yourself to bring it back. Now, this state-bounded thing, it's important to notice. We talk about how dreams are state-bounded, how psychedelic experiences are state-bounded, but what we fail to notice usually is that ordinary reality is state-bounded. I mean, if I were to ask any one of you, what did you discuss with the person you had lunch with yesterday? It's probably very touch and go to actually put this together. I had lunch yesterday with Richard. We discussed his television transmission system, but that was new to me and therefore easy to retain. And also, Richard and I haven't had thousands of hours of conversation together, but the person we are most familiar with is ourselves. Well, I don't know if it works for you like this, but I am, let us say, cleaning my house, vacuuming, doing dishes, making beds, and I'm thinking, all the time, thinking. And I understand why Rome fell. I realize what I said wrong to somebody 2 weeks ago. I recall a telephone obligation that I have to fulfill. I think about things that happened years and years ago. And then the doorbell rings, and I go to the door, and there's someone there, and they say, "What are you doing?" And I say, "Nothing." This is because the ordinary state of consciousness is highly state-bounded. We don't... One thing these Buddhists have certainly gotten right is that attention to attention is the key to taking control of your mental life. And for most of it, it's just like a river flowing by, and every once in a while we check to see if the river is still flowing by, but we don't attempt to retain it. So memory training is great psychedelic training. And of course, as I'm sure you know, there were arts of memory in the past. We are very poor memorizers because we rely on technologies to do it for us. But people in the past had all kinds of technologies for allowing them to remember things. For instance, the most common one in use in late antiquity and up through the Renaissance was the memory palace approach. This is where you think of a place, a big place preferably, a place you know well, a school, a hospital, a cathedral, a university, but big, and sit and think about it. Think about how it looks as you go through the main doors, and then what you see when you turn to the left, and what you see when you turn to the right. Learn this building until you really can command it with reasonable vividness in most situations. Then, if you want to remember something, imagine yourself walking through the front door of this building, turning to your left, and there near the water fountain you will place an emblem of this thing you want to remember. And then you will go down the hall and around the corner, and by the fire extinguishers you will place another emblem of the next thing you want to remember. Well, then the act of remembering this long list of things is the act of mentally moving through this imaginary building that you know. And when you come to the water fountain, the clue will be there. When you pass the fire extinguishers in your mind, the emblem you placed there will be there. Now, I know this sounds highly unworkable and unwieldy, but it actually is extremely workable. And people like Catullus and Cicero, the great late Roman orators, were able to speak for hours on end with lists of virtues and vices and interconnecting causes and this sort of thing, because they were masters of this mnemonic memory palace technique. Well, psychedelics are a vivid, this is another one of these things like mantras, yantras, and so forth that works on psychedelics. You can do this. And so when you're on a psychedelic and you have an experience that you want to remember, place it in your memory palace. And the next time you come past that point in your memory palace, this thing will be there. Now, the other trick is, any of you who are interested in this, the last word is The Art of Memory by Frances Yates, which is a wonderful woman, great scholar of Renaissance magic. And the final trick is to make the image extremely vivid, so that, for instance, if you're about to give a speech to your collegium on the 7 deadly sins, well, then one of these sins is lust. I chose the easy one because I can't remember what the other 6 are. Shows you where my problem lies. So you don't just place the word lust in the memory keeping spot. You place some vivid and shocking image. Yeats suggests the image of a nun lifting her skirts. I think this was a classically suggested one that people were taught to use. Well, then, when you come around the corner and meet the nun lifting her skirts, you think, aha, lust. That's the first, and then you go on and so forth. And books, some of the most astonishing products of the medieval engraver's art, are these books of what are called emblemata. Emblemata are surreal juxtapositions of things and animal parts and bodies and machines that are memory emblems, made as grotesque, surreal, and bizarre as possible in order to make them unforgettable. That was the technique. And the surrealists used this very consciously. There is something about the unexpected, the grotesque, and the surprising that is, almost by definition, memorable. And this will work very well in the psychedelic state as well.
If you were asked, just like that thing with your I Love Lucy, when I did the mushroom experience, and there were certain issues, certain things I went to that ceremony with on my agenda to be healed from. And one of them was to be released from some of my early Catholic conditionings that I felt were hanging me up. And when I was in the experience, they talked about los niños, the little helpers that would come. And I asked, just like Lucy, I said, I need some help. What can you help me with? And I looked at my hand, and how could you forget something like this? The fucking blood started to come out of my hand, and right in the middle of my hand, this blood came right out of the palm and started dripping. And I'm bleeding. It's like, it doesn't hurt. I'm bleeding to death here, and this doesn't even hurt. It was like the whole suffering stuff of what Catholics are conditioned with. And it came to me out of the stigmata, and I looked at my other hand, the same thing was happening, and I was going, my God, I'm feeling this crucifixion, thing, and the St. Stephen, and my name was in the martyr, and all of this martyrdom shit I've subjected on and on. I mean, I could talk for another 30 minutes about how meaningful that was to me. But talk about you want an image, you want a vision. Ask the mushroom god, give me a vision. That'll give you one.
Oh yeah, ask and you'll receive.
I'm really interested in the legal aspect of this thing. You're talking something about highly illegal. As far as the law is concerned, how do you handle it? Anybody that drives around with a license plate that says NNDMT, I wonder, are you paranoid about it? Obviously not.
No, I'm not paranoid about it. If they wanted me, they should have come a long time ago, because I was much more vulnerable then. I've sort of covered my ass. Naturally, if you speak about these things, you can't do anything particularly illegal. And perhaps I'm foolish in the sense that I shouldn't be worried about being arrested, I should be worried about being shot. If that's how they play the game, then I'm in big trouble, because they'll just come and shoot me, and you too if you get into this. But if we actually have a legal system that works, then this is called advocacy, and it's not a crime. It's an exercise of the First, Fourth, and a couple of other amendments to the Constitution. Henry David Thoreau, you don't get more American than that, said that if you are right, you are a majority of one. And we live by majority rule. I don't feel heroic. I mean, it's not false modesty or anything. I don't feel heroic doing this. This is really humdrum to me. I just could not behave any other way because of what I've seen. I mean, this transcends laws. All that it's seen as preposterous. I mean, there are. I believe in universal laws. You shouldn't kill people. You shouldn't lie to people. You shouldn't inject yourself between lovers. Most cultures, I think, recognize a set of universal laws, but thou shalt not smoke marijuana? Surely the God of Mount Sinai has better things to do than worry about that sort of thing. We have to create a new option. All social progress is made by people taking chances. If I am an anomaly, some kind of dangerous sociopath, then my message will be swamped and lost in the noise of the tumult of the world, because there are thousands of messages out there. If, on the other hand, this is a great and important domain of truth, then they are crazy to try and repress it, because it cannot be repressed. They have tried to repress it. Oh,
why have they tried to repress it? If use of psychoactive drugs is so good for the psyche, why have they repressed it?
They sought to repress it because there's something in the Western mind that is very nervous, that gets very nervous when you try to talk about the bedrock of ontology. McLuhan talked about this. He met great resistance, and all he was saying was that print had created certain kinds of unconscious biases in society in favor of uniformity, linearity, and like that. And he was amazed at the violence of the reaction against this. And he concluded that those cultures that have evolved from the phonetic alphabet are so removed from the stuff of the world, as opposed to languages like Chinese or Mayan or something like that, where there is a retention of the image in the written language, that the cultures descended from the phonetic alphabet are extremely paranoid about questions about the nature of reality. And that's what this is really about. The psychedelic issue does not relate to the drug issue at all. I mean, in fact, it's important to make this point. Drugs and psychedelics are not two members of a family, they are antithetically opposed to each other. The pro-psychedelic position is an anti-drug position. Now, how can this be, since we are accustomed to thinking of psychedelics as drugs? Well, it's like this. What is it that we object to about drugs? And I think everybody can agree, maybe not everybody, but most people can agree, we do have a drug problem. I mean, if you live in the inner cities, you see people getting all twisted up behind this stuff. We have a drug problem. So what is it about drugs that we find problematic? Well, I think that what is objectionable about drugs is that they cause unconscious, obsessive, destructive, self or other behavior. Unconscious, obsessive behavior is intolerable because we are conscious people accustomed to injecting choice and meaning into our lives. You cannot have meaning if you do not have choice. This is why we don't have to spend any time at all talking about whether the world is predestined. Because if the world is predestined, then I'm not saying what I'm saying because it's what I want to say. I'm saying what I'm saying because I can't say anything else. And you're sitting there because you can't not sit there. So it makes the world very dull and uninteresting. Compulsive, unexamined, obsessive behavior is the quintessence of anti-human behavior. It was Bertalanffy, the founder of general systems theory, who said, people are not machines, but in every situation where they're given an opportunity to behave like machines, they'll go for it. Then are drugs which reinforce obsessive and unexamined and self-destructive behavior patterns. Well, what do psychedelics do? They destroy behavior patterns, destroy cultural assumptions, completely hold everything up for grabs, completely throw open the possibility that reality could be any of a number of ways that are not culturally sanctioned. So in that sense, the psychedelics are almost the answer to the drug problem. And the early use of psychedelics reported spectacular progress with alcoholism. Well, now see, the people who believe that alcoholism is a disease, and I don't follow this literature closely, it seems to me this is a preposterous statement. I mean, a disease? You mean like influenza and smallpox and AIDS? Alcoholism is a disease? Can you get it if you don't practice safe sex? Or do you have to wash your eating utensils? It isn't a disease. What it is it's a failure of self-image. And the reason LSD, in many cases, had a tremendous impact on alcoholic behavior was because it just showed people what they were doing. Said, this is you. You're a drunk. You're a burden to your family, a bore to your friends. You smell bad and you're useless. How do you like it? And so somebody said, I don't like it. I said, well, then stop drinking. That's what it is. That's how psychedelics cure addiction. And nobody, when they talk about addiction, nobody ever talks about what is called self-restraint.
Terence, there's a new book that came out about a month or two ago that's incredibly, I don't remember the name offhand, incredibly controversial.
But alcoholism?
Yeah, that
heavy drinking. Myth of alcoholism is a disease.
Right, yeah. And the man takes the position that the last 30 or 40 years where we've seen alcoholism as a disease is just, more bullshit from the medical model. And we need another alternative. And of course, AA and everybody's just up in arms about the book.
Well, yeah, AA has
I don't remember now.
What did you say? The name of the book is it's by Finnegrad. It's called Heavy Drinking, the Myth of Alcoholism as a Disease. Basically, he discusses the fact that it's a rationalization to say that it's a disease. I mean, there are certain people, I think, that have certain chemical reactions to alcohol, but they're in the minority, and that this is very important to me as well because this is work that I'm interested in. And alcoholism has also touched my family, as it has a lot of families. And
Yeah, I think
You know,
the
it's
disease
self-perpetuating.
model
Yeah.
has there's no responsibility involved, you know. And AA, their position, their goal is not to understand the nature of the universe. They're not in the philosophy business. They're trying to get people to stop drinking. So to maximize that goal, I think that they go far overboard. First of all substances, they say, if you're an alcoholic, then you must forswear everything. I don't know how they relate to tobacco. But see, what you've got to understand is we are set up for addiction. It's just like language and cognition and all of these other things. We are the animal which addicts. Other animals don't addict. And addiction is a way of relating to the world. We don't not only addict to drugs, we addict to each other, to chunks of territory, to behavior patterns.
It's like attaching ourselves to what we see and what...
Exactly. It's attachment. We attach to everything. And it's very real. It's physiological. I remember years and years ago, a woman left me for a homunculus, and I was appalled. And it became. I mean, I was like vomiting every 4 hours. Could not sleep. Would burst into tears in inappropriate situations, of which there were many in my life. And heroin withdrawal cannot be worse than that. I mean, are you kidding? Vomiting every 4 hours? And then one night, in the middle of the night, I was just frantic, because I felt like when I was awake, I felt like I wanted to be asleep. When I should have been sleeping, I couldn't sleep, and I was just dragging myself to classes. I felt, this is crazy. I should turn myself in, but they don't have crisis centers for broken hearts. What are you going to do? So then, in the middle of one of these bouts, I went to the medicine cabinet, and this woman who had left me had left all these pills there. And I sorted through all these pills and came upon a small bottle of tranquilizers, of a very mild tranquilizer, like Valium or something. Well, I had never taken a Valium. So I said, I'll take half. And I took it, and the next morning, or a few hours later, I went out to breakfast, and somebody came up and sat at my table and said, well, how are you coping since Hermione left you? And I said, who? Just jerk, and it really gave me respect for tranquilizers. I mean, I was appalled. I was appalled that something so real to me, so much me, half the tab, I didn't care, let him go. And then I realized all the people around me, this is how they deal with emotional crisis. Nobody wants to feel anything. I mean, the moment that an unpleasant emotion rears its head, people go take Valium or something else and cut themselves off from feeling. We addict to people. That's the point of that story. And when they leave us suddenly, it's just like having your heroin taken away and you become a mad thing for months, years sometimes. I mean, I still vibrate from this event, and it was 15 years ago. We addict to territory. This is war, our turf, our land. Now, this arises, again, a consequence of agriculture. Before agriculture, nobody had land. Land was something you walked around on as you migrated behind your herds. Once it was cognized as an object and fixed upon, they were ready to knock the other guy's brains out for setting foot on your territory. We all do this. I mean, we are addicted to caffeine. outrageous caffeine addictions. Money, sugar, praise, television. Now this is the favorite one to talk about because television is a forerunner of very insidious drugs to come. It's just the crudest and the first. But imagine if after World War II, a drug had been introduced into this country of right-thinking, hard-working, decent Christian people, such that 20 years after its induction, the average American citizen would be spending 6.5 hours per day involved in this drug. That's the figure for television consumption in this country. The average American watches 6.5 hours a day of TV. It is an electronic drug. It is an obsessive behavior pattern, an unconscious behavior pattern, and a physically destructive behavior pattern. I mean, it's done more for the rebirth of hemorrhoid specialists than any other single force in our society. So, but people say, well, that's not a drug, that's entertainment. 6.5 hours a day of entertainment? You know, before electronic media, a person could regard themselves as a great patron of, let's say, the musical community, and maybe they would hear 12 live musical performances a year when they would go to a theater. I mean, how many people in Beethoven, how many experts on Beethoven in his generation or the generation following heard, let's say, the Ninth Symphony more than several times in their intellectual life? Because, you know, you have to get a lot of people together and cooperating to perform the Ninth Symphony. To us, the Ninth Symphony is an object. Listen to it. Listen again. Listen again. We are able to turn experience, we are able to objectify experience and then addict ourselves to it. Well, is this bad? How can it be bad if it is so written into us? I don't think it is bad. I think what we have to do is choose our addictions, choose our behavior patterns. I mean, one can choose to be addicted to punctuality. I'm accused of this. Other people are addicted to always being late. One can be addicted to, meaningless sexual encounters.
Some difference in habits and addictions.
You mean because of the physiological angle? Well, I think that's been much overplayed. I think, should we not fall in love because we pheromonally lock together with this person and become a single unified set of drives and goals? The physiological aspects of addiction have been, I think, very strongly overdrawn. I smoke cannabis every day at most opportunities and have for years and years, since I was 18 years old. Every once in a while, I stop just to see what that's like. It's trivial. It's utterly easy. All that happens is a shift in behavior patterns. I read more. That's what happens when I stop smoking cannabis. And yet I'm supposed to be breaking out into cold sweats, wandering aimlessly through the streets of the city, staring up at lighted windows. Yeah, right. So I think we give each other too much permission to be weak in this area. What is never talked about in talk about addiction is self-restraint. For heaven's sake, just take hold of yourself. Responsibility. And if you tell people addiction is a disease, addiction is it's because you're black, it's because you're poor, it's because you're this, it's because you're that, you have just given them a whole bunch of reasons not to take responsibility for their own situation. And what is needed in these addictive situations, I think, is the shock of recognition. I believe, that if you don't take drugs, you're unbearable. And I can't think of a society on earth where people don't take drugs that any of us would want to have anything to do with. I mean, let's take Calvinist Geneva, say. I imagine that as an example of an environment of moral rectitude. I mean, these people did not wear bright colors, didn't listen to music, never drank coffee, never smoked, forget about alcohol, sex for procreation, so forth and so on. And they are paradigms of the male ego frozen in place, didactic, paternalistic, all-knowing, filled with hellfire and damnation. Everything is seen in terms of a moral dimension that makes impossible demands on the human animal. Rather, I think what we should realize is that somehow our evolution into a civilized, self-reflecting being is caught up in these synergistic relationships that our conscious mind has with various things in the environment, so that we should choose our addictions. Now notice that addictions, to my mind, and you can argue with this if you want by choosing extreme examples, but addictions to natural substances are harmless. Let me name some natural substances that you might disagree with me on this point. I think probably the strongest one would be, people would say, well, what about opium? Surely this is the scourge of mankind. Actually, opium was never a problem in human populations until it was conceived of as a problem by British colonial policymakers who decided that they could manipulate the opium trade to get an entree into China. Alcohol was never a problem, particularly, until the discovery of distilled alcohol. And, of course, heroin is distilled opium. Morphine also. Sugar is a refined vegetable substance. In every case, it has required the intercession of science and technology to take harmless habits and turn them into dangerous addictions, so that everybody has a solution to the drug problem. I think what I would suggest is something called the Vegetable Drug Act, where you just say, if it's a vegetable, it's not a drug. This was the position until very recently with British common law. In Canada, mushrooms were legal. Mushrooms aren't psilocybin. Psilocybin is a refined chemical. If it is technology which allows us then to create these super powerful addicting substances, and there will be more and more of them downstream, you may be sure. So I think what we need to do is think of human beings as hardware, as the computer, if you will, and drugs are forms of software. And the software that you run determines the kind of functions that you can perform. If you run distilled alcohol software, well, then you take on the persona of the alcoholic. I believe that cannabis is probably the most harmless and benign drug around. It carries out this feminizing that I talked about. It lowers the profile of the male ego. Instead of wanting to duke it out, people just say, well, if that's your thing, and that's what we need, I mean, that practically boils down to what we call tolerance. So I think that this disruption of our relationships to psychoactive plants is what set us on the long, hard, downward path into neurosis. And it began with agriculture. with the narrowing of our spectrum of plant awareness from many, many plants down to the rye, the oats, the barley. And it's interesting that then out of this came the cultivation of, I think beer preceded wine. Beer is an older thing than wine. That comes out of the fact of having created surpluses. Because the way beer was discovered was through the fermentation of grain that was stored. If you didn't have surpluses, you would never discover the psychoactive properties of fermented grain. It's very interesting. In Nepal, the Newari people have an alcoholic beverage that when it's put in front of you, it looks like a bowl of granola. It's dry. They pour it out of a sack into your cup, and you say, this is beer? And then they come along with boiling water and pour it over it, and then you get this foamy, lightly fermented, contaminated grain water. And to my mind, that clearly is then how fermentation of grains and production of alcohol was established. Notice that it was also the accumulation of surplus from the agricultural adaptation that creates the need for defense. Because now you've got a surplus. Now you have to guard your surplus from everybody who doesn't have any. The other thing that creation of surpluses caused was the invention of barter and money and this sort of thing, because now you have something that you can trade for something that you don't have. So all of these adaptations, also a nomadic people cannot move a grain surplus with them. So if your harvest one year, if you're a semi-nomadic people, that's a people who, like in the Amazon, they plant things and then they leave them and go away, and they have like a yearly peregrination, and when they come back to that place a year later, there's all this food ready for them. Well, imagine a nomadic people who were doing that kind of quasi-agriculture with cereal, and then there's 1 year of great weather and great rainfall, and when they arrive at their little wheat patch, so much wheat has been produced that they can't move it. They can't take it with them. So then they say, well, but we have food now, so we don't have to keep hunting, so let's spend the winter here. And this interruption of the cycle of nomadism to deal with unexpected surpluses obviously spawned the idea in people's minds, well, wouldn't it be great if we had surpluses every year? And then that says, well, that won't happen if we're as careless as we have been about our sowing and harvesting, but maybe if we're very careful and till the land and carefully plant and do careful weeding, we'll have to stay here and weed, but then we'll get this tremendous payback in the end. So, to my mind, the invention of agriculture broke our relationship to the wild plants and the lowered profile of the male ego, and set us on a path of defending wealth, creating fortifications, supporting more specialization, larger populations, so forth and so on. And from there to the present predicament, it's only a moment. Pardon me?
Lots of consequences stem from that too. Such, fear of losing your wealth, then consequently fighting to protect it.
That's right.
Lots of consequences.
And also this idea of our land, because you want to hang on to this good cereal growing land, so it's yours, you say, and then you put a wall around it, and then you defend it, and so forth and so on. Well, yeah.
Just where do you see this going? Where do you see taking this break with nature and the position that we've gotten ourselves in? How do you see it?
Well, I think that things are very far out of hand, and we're caught up now in the end game of history, and that we are going to have to create a way out of this impasse that is probably going to mean a complete redefining of who we are and how we relate to each other, and space and time and life and death. And it appears that technology is now the thing that is guiding us forward. We are not being led into the future by politicians. Politicians are running frantically along behind the wagon of history, trying to jump onto it. What is leading us, what's pulling the cart, is technology. And I think technology is the program of realizing the practical concerns of the imagination. And that really where we are headed is the imagination. It's a place. I don't know whether it's in solid-state circuitry or in the bones of the planet or in artificial arcologies in deep space. The future will figure out the details, but we are close enough to it now that we can anticipate it. It's what the shamans always said was possible, a world of value and meaning lived in the light of nature. And I think if we can get through this narrow neck that rationalism has imposed upon us and overcome these poisonous paternalistic philosophies, we will return. That's why I call it the archaic revival. It's the myth of the eternal return. History is something that you finish with as quickly as possible and then return to the archaic mode of eternity. And I think that's the adventure that we're all caught up in. That's the agenda that the plants and the planet have always had in front of them. It's just that we wandered away from an awareness of what was happening by deluding ourselves with our own inflated self-image. You know, man as master of woman and nature. And this distorted part of our self-image has now become so dangerous to us that we have to abandon it. We have to draw back from it. And under that kind of pressure, I think we will. So, harking back to another question, the reason I do this and the reason I don't feel any great trepidation about it is because I believe that historical momentum is with us. This is what is destined to come to be. We are going to take control of who we are by taking control of the physiological and psychological foundations upon which the self rests. And that means the chemical re-engineering of ourselves into the state of Edenic innocence that was lost when we set out on the long trail of the sword and the hoe, basically. That's it. End of weekend. Thank you very, very much. It's a political point of view, you see, and as a practical matter, there's no better way to succeed in politics than to champion the most out of it point of view. And now we live in an era where beige fascism is apparently the rising rule of the day. Well, that means if you want to be on the cutting edge, you have to embrace something very akin to psychedelic anarchy, the absolute antithesis of the fascist state. And then you will participate in the turning of the tide and the vindication of this point of view. And it will be vindicated, there's no doubt about it. All other points of view are bankrupt on the face of them. End of footnote. Mm-hmm.